Hegel's dialectic. Hegelian dialectic is a mode of thought that sees reality and consciousness as processes in perpetual development, driven by contradictions and their resolution. Rather than considering oppositions as dead ends, Hegel sees them as necessary moments of a triadic movement, often simplified as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. In this framework, an initial position, or thesis, is confronted with its negation, known as antithesis, and their tension leads to a new reality, the synthesis, that integrates, transcends, and preserves elements of both. This process, repeated at various levels like logic, nature, history, and spirit, is driven by the concept of Aufhebung, or sublation, which simultaneously preserves, negates, and transcends a given reality to bring forth a more developed and freer one. Thus, Hegelian dialectic is not a static back and forth, but insists that contradiction is the motor of development, allowing for qualitative leaps in the evolution of consciousness and spirit. The consciousness of beings. In itself and for itself. In Hegelian thought, the distinction between what is in itself, en soi, and what is for itself, pour soi, is fundamental to understanding the development of consciousness. In itself, consciousness refers to a state of being that merely exists without self-reflection. A being in itself exists in its immediacy, without yet developing the capacity to recognize itself as an autonomous subject. It is characterized by passive acceptance of what is, without questioning or appropriating its relationship to the world. For itself, consciousness, on the other hand, implies a reflexive and autonomous dimension. The being that reaches for itself recognizes itself as a subject, aware of its freedom and capacity for self-determination. This transition from immediacy to self-reflection allows for a deeper understanding of both self and world, while necessitating mutual recognition between subjects. The shift from being in itself to being for itself is a fundamental evolution, moving from mere existence to genuine autonomy and freedom. How the immediate environment shapes the evolution from in itself to for itself consciousness. The immediate environment plays a crucial role in the transition from an in itself being to a for itself consciousness. From a dialectical perspective, this passage does not occur in isolation, but through confrontation with an external world that forces the being to position itself in relation to something other than itself. Confrontation with the other and the external world compels a being to differentiate itself from its environment. When an individual encounters the contingencies of the world, objects, other living beings, social norms, they are forced to take a stance, to define themselves against what is external. This dialectical process, where immediacy is negated in favor of a new synthesis, marks the transition from mere existence to self-awareness. Language and symbolic mediation reinforce this transition. Language, as a medium of communication and thought, allows one to represent oneself and distinguish oneself from what is simply given. Thus, interacting with an environment rich in meaning and social imperatives fosters the emergence of reflexivity and the construction of an identity for itself. The experience of alienation also plays a dialectical role. Being objectified or dominated by external forces, whether by nature or social structures, creates a contradiction that pushes the individual to reclaim their existence. The tension between being in itself and the experience of alterity encourages the development of a for-itself consciousness. In a society, it is common to find the coexistence of individuals who have not yet fully attained autonomy, having an in-itself consciousness, and others who have initiated or completed the transition to full self-reflection or for-itself consciousness. This heterogeneity generates complex dynamics, mutual recognition, and the struggle for it. For Hegel, the realization of for-itself consciousness requires recognition from the other. In a social context, those who have reached a for-itself consciousness seek to be acknowledged as autonomous and free subjects. When such recognition is absent, especially from beings still in itself who have not developed the same reflexive capacity, an imbalance emerges. The struggle for recognition can then degenerate into power dynamics where some impose their vision of freedom and subjectivity onto others. Domination and subordination. Those who have not yet reached full for itself consciousness risk being objectified and becoming instruments of the will of those who perceive themselves as fully autonomous. Paradoxically, this dynamic of domination is not merely negative, it is also dialectical, as it generates tensions that can provoke a challenge and an eventual overcoming of the established order. Thus, apparent domination can contain the seeds of transformation, as the subordinated individual, confronted with their lack of recognition, aspires to liberation and self-constitution as a subject for itself. The dialectic of recognition. Hegel's famous master-slave dialectic illustrates this dynamic perfectly. The unequal relationship initially leads to domination, but the confrontation with the lack or insufficiency of recognition creates a potential reversal, allowing the subordinated being to gain awareness of their own value and claim autonomy. Each stage in the development of consciousness has its intrinsic limitations, which, rather than being mere flaws, act as the driving force behind dialectical evolution. Flaws of in-itself consciousness, passivity and immediacy. The in-itself being exists without questioning itself. It does not reflect on its nature or engage with its own contradictions. Lack of reflexivity. This consciousness does not allow one to situate oneself as a free subject or project into the future. It is static and constrained by given circumstances. Vulnerability to objectification. Without the ability to recognize itself as a subject, the in-itself being can easily be reduced to an object, passively subjected to external determinations. Flaws of for-itself consciousness. The temptation of isolation. A fully developed for-itself consciousness, when confronted with its ideal of autonomy, may fall into extreme individualism, disconnected from others. The spiral of ego-reflexivity, if not balanced by mutual recognition, can lead to excessive self-centeredness, where the being becomes lost in an illusory quest for self. Internal contradictions. Even in its most advanced form, for itself consciousness carries contradictions, such as the tension between absolute freedom and the necessity of community, that require continual dialectical resolution. The necessity of dialectical dynamics. The tensions or even flaws inherent in each form of consciousness should not be seen as mere defects to be corrected, but as the vital impulses of an ever richer and more complex becoming. Transformation engine. The contradictions between the immediacy of in-itself consciousness and the reflexivity of for-itself consciousness stimulate the dialectical movement that allows consciousness to surpass itself. Each conflict, each apparent domination, generates a crisis that, once overcome, enables a qualitative leap in the development of subjectivity. Sublation and integration. The dialectical process integrates the positive aspects of each stage while overcoming their insufficiencies. Thus, the passivity of in-itself consciousness is transcended by the freedom of for-itself consciousness, while remaining anchored in concrete reality. Evolution of freedom. For Hegel, freedom is not a static state, but the result of a dialectical process where each stage, even imperfect, contributes to the development of an increasingly free and self-determined spirit. Hegelian dialectic, by engaging the confrontation of opposites and the sublation of their contradictions, explains the transition from being in itself to being for itself. The immediate environment, through its alterity and demands, forces beings to surpass themselves, forming autonomous subjects. The resulting social interactions create struggles for recognition and power dynamics, yet these conflicts drive historical and individual development. Ultimately, the tensions within each stage of consciousness are not obstacles but necessary impulses for the evolution of thought and freedom.